They told you some men lose their voice from fear, but the truth is darker than that. In the late summer of 1883, in a quiet corner of Georgia where the red clay held more secrets than bones, there lived a man who had not spoken a single word in 19 years. Not one, not a whisper, not a plea, not even his own name. And yet everyone feared him. Not because he was violent, not because he was powerful, but because men in Harrow County believed something far more dangerous. They believed Elias Drew remembered everything. Listen carefully, because the story you are about to hear is not simply about a silent man. It is about power, about systems built on silence, about the invisible machinery that decides whose voice matters and whose voice must disappear. And more importantly, why one man refused to play along. For 19 years, Elias Drew walked through Harrow County like a ghost that could not die. Men spoke around him as if he were furniture. Women lowered their eyes when he passed. Children watched him from behind porch rails like he was some ancient creature that had crawled out of the forest. But they all felt it, that quiet gravity around him, the kind that does not come from weakness, it comes from discipline. Because silence, real silence, is not the absence of speech. It is control. And control terrifies people who live by noise. The plantation fields still stretched for miles around the Voss estate. Cotton rose like scars across the land. The war had ended nearly 2 decades earlier, but anyone who told you slavery died in 1865 was either naive or lying. Systems rarely disappear. They mutate. The chains simply changed shape. Contracts replaced whips, iron replaced debt, and the same men remained in charge. The white columns of the Voss mansion still stood over Harrow County like a faded throne, paint peeling, pride rotting, power lingering. And moving through this world without a single spoken word was Elias Drew, a man built like a blacksmith's anvil. Broad shoulders carved by decades under the sun, hands thick with calluses that could mend fences, break stones, or calm a spooked horse with nothing but a touch. But the thing people remembered most about him was his eyes. They were not dull, they were not empty. They were watching, always watching, like a man studying a chessboard that everyone else believed was already finished. You see, when a man stops speaking, something strange happens. He starts listening, really listening. He notices things other people miss: tone, fear, lies, the subtle tremor in someone's voice when truth brushes too close. Elias had been listening for 19 years, and what he heard during those 19 years was enough to bury an entire town. But here's the part most men misunderstand. Silence was never his weakness. It was his weapon. Because Elias Drew learned something early in life that powerful men spend fortunes trying to hide. Words give your enemies access to your mind. Silence denies them the map. And when a man refuses to provide the map, people begin to fear what he might know. So the town invented stories. Some said Elias had lost his voice in the war. Some claimed he had been cursed by God. Others whispered darker things, that he had seen something so terrible, something so unforgivable, that he chose silence rather than let the truth destroy the world around him. But none of those stories were correct, not even close. Because the real reason Elias Drew stopped speaking was not fear, it was strategy. And the night his silence finally broke inside that courtroom, it didn't just save a man's life, it exposed the entire machine. But to understand why 19 years of silence exploded in a single moment, you have to go back to the day someone tried to burn his voice out of existence.
Before Elias Drew became the silent man of Harrow County, he was something far more dangerous. He was a man who understood words, not just how to speak them, but how they could reshape the world. And in the American South of the 1850s, there were few things more threatening than an enslaved man who could read. You must understand something about power. Real power is not enforced by violence alone. Violence is crude, temporary, unrefined. The real system, the one that lasts generations, is built on control of knowledge. If people cannot read, they cannot question. If they cannot question, they cannot organize. If they cannot organize, they remain exactly where you want them. That was the rule. That was the design. And Elias Drew broke it. He was born on the Voss plantation sometime around 1838, though records were vague, intentionally vague. Enslaved people were rarely granted the dignity of precise history. But his mother remembered. Sarah Drew, a woman whose mind moved quietly but sharply beneath the obedience she performed for the plantation household. Sarah worked in the kitchen, cooking, cleaning, listening. And like many women history forgot to name, she understood something essential about survival. If the body is enslaved, the mind must remain free. So she taught her son in secret, not during the day, never during the day. Daylight belonged to the masters, night belonged to the hidden world. By candlelight stolen from the pantry, by scraps of newspaper pulled from trash barrels, by labels peeled from medicine bottles, Sarah taught Elias letters, slowly, patiently, dangerously. Because if they had been caught, the punishment would not have been a simple beating. The punishment would have been example-making, the kind of punishment designed not just to hurt you, but to teach everyone else never to try again. Yet Elias absorbed language like a man discovering oxygen. Words unlocked doors, books unlocked universes, history, geography, poetry, philosophy, ideas that had been carefully walled away from people like him. Soon, Elias wasn't just reading, he was writing. He stitched together crude journals from scrap paper and thread. Inside those journals, he wrote everything. Observations, dreams, sketches of birds flying above the cotton fields, descriptions of the river after rainstorms, thoughts about the strange contradictions he saw in the people who claimed ownership over human beings. Because the boy noticed things, patterns, hypocrisy. The way men preached virtue on Sundays, then whipped someone on Monday. And the more Elias wrote, the more dangerous he became. Not outwardly, not violently, but intellectually. You see, systems of control depend on one fragile illusion, that the oppressed do not fully see the system. But Elias did. And the more he wrote, the more he understood something profound. The plantation was not just a place, it was a structure of belief, a shared lie strong enough that thousands of people participated in maintaining it, even those who suffered beneath it. But Elias's journals contained something forbidden, truth. Not loud truth, not revolutionary speeches, but quiet truth, the kind that accumulates, the kind that records patterns, the kind that eventually makes denial impossible. And that made the journals dangerous, because a man who records truth becomes something powerful, a witness. Witnesses threaten systems, not because they shout, but because they remember. For years, Elias wrote in secret, his notebook stacked beneath loose boards in the cabin he shared with his mother, page after page documenting a world that insisted it was righteous, but deep down was terrified of being seen clearly. And then one day, the wrong man found them, a plantation overseer named Caleb Pruitt, a man who believed control must always be reinforced with humiliation. Pruitt didn't beat Elias when he discovered the journals. No, he chose something far more calculated, something designed to send a message. He gathered every notebook Elias had ever written, years of thought, years of memory, years of truth, and he threw them into a fire, one page at a time, while forcing Elias to watch. And as the flames devoured the boy's entire written life, something inside him changed. Not shattered, not collapsed, changed. Because in that moment, Elias Drew realized something most men never figure out. Words can be stolen, books can be burned, voices can be silenced, but memory cannot be confiscated. And from that moment forward, Elias Drew made a decision that would confuse an entire county for nearly 2 decades. If the world was determined to destroy his words, then he would simply stop giving them any. The voice they tried to control would disappear, but the mind behind it, the mind would keep recording everything. And someday, when the right moment arrived, all 19 years of silence would detonate in a single sentence. But first, the world would have to forget he was even capable of speaking.
The morning after his journals burned, something about Elias Drew had changed. Not visibly, not in a way most people could immediately explain, but the shift was there. Before that fire, Elias had been known across the Voss plantation as the boy who asked too many questions, the one who sang while he worked, the one who spoke with an ease that made even older men pause and listen. After that fire, the voice disappeared. At first, people assumed grief or fear. Sarah noticed it immediately. The kitchen women whispered about it while preparing breakfast. Elias moved through the yard carrying water buckets, stacking wood, feeding the animals, but he did not greet anyone, did not sing, did not respond when spoken to. Just silence. When his mother finally asked him why he wasn't speaking, Elias looked at her with eyes that seemed older than the boy she had raised, and he simply shook his head. No explanation, no anger, just decision. Sarah understood something then that most others didn't. Her son had not been broken. He had closed a door. October 17th, 1883, arrived like any other autumn day in Harrow County. That is how history usually disguises itself. Not with thunder, not with warning. Just another sunrise over fields that have seen too much and said too little. The cotton fields shimmered pale under the Georgia sun. Workers moved through the rows slowly, the rhythm of labor as familiar as breathing. Wagons creaked along dusty paths. Horses stomped lazily in the stable yard. From a distance, the Voss estate looked peaceful. But peace is often the final mask a system wears before it breaks. Elias Drew noticed the tension before anyone else, because tension speaks loudly to a man who lives in silence. Clara Hayes moved differently that day, faster. Her usual calm presence had been replaced by something sharper, urgency. Elias saw it when she crossed the yard carrying a stack of supply invoices. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, jaw set tight. The quiet determination of someone who had decided something. Inside the big house, Eleanor Voss studied the plantation accounts again. Numbers, rows of figures, small inconsistencies that had grown too frequent to ignore. Flour deliveries that never arrived, cotton yields that didn't match shipment receipts, payments recorded twice. Someone had been draining the plantation slowly, and Eleanor knew exactly who controlled those ledgers. Jedediah Finch, the foreman, the man who had quietly positioned himself between Harland Voss and the daily workings of the estate. A gatekeeper, and gatekeepers often become thieves. But accusations required proof, and proof was dangerous. Clara understood that, which is why she had waited weeks before confronting him. But that afternoon, something inside her decided waiting was no longer safe.
She found Jedediah near the supply shed just before dusk. The conversation began quietly, almost polite. From the distance of the stable yard, Elias watched their body language the way a seasoned hunter watches animals before a storm. Clara held papers. Jedediah leaned closer than necessary. At first, his posture showed irritation, then disbelief, then something darker, fear. People often misunderstand criminals. They imagine monsters. But most criminals are ordinary men who simply refuse to accept consequences. And when consequences finally appear, they panic. That's when systems become violent. Clara said something that changed Jedediah's posture completely. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes darted toward the main house, toward the windows where Eleanor sometimes watched the yard. Then he grabbed Clara's wrist, hard. Elias noticed. Clara pulled away. She said something else, louder this time, firm, not afraid. A mistake. Jedediah stepped closer again, his face tight, jaw clenched. Elias could not hear the words, but he didn't need to. The body always tells the truth the mouth tries to hide. Clara pointed at the papers. Jedediah slapped them from her hand. The pages scattered across the dirt. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Clara turned and walked toward the main house, toward Eleanor Voss, toward exposure. Jedediah stood frozen in the yard, watching her go. And in that moment, Elias saw something that made his stomach tighten. Calculation, not panic. Decision. Because some men don't choose between right and wrong. They choose between survival and destruction. And if the system protects them, they believe they can do anything. Night fell slowly over the plantation. Lanterns flickered on inside the house. Workers returned to cabins. The cicadas began their endless song. Elias sat on the small porch of his cabin like he always did, still, listening, watching the distant windows of the Voss house. And sometime after midnight, the light in Harlan Voss's study flickered violently. Shadows moved behind the curtains. Two figures, one tall, one smaller. An argument. Even without sound, anger has a shape, sharp gestures, abrupt movements. The small figure backed away, the larger one advanced. Then, a crash, something breaking, a sudden movement that ended in stillness, and seconds later, a single muffled cry. It was the kind of sound that travels through the night like a blade, short, desperate, cut off too quickly. Elias stood, slowly, carefully, moving closer to the tree line that overlooked the back of the house. Minutes passed. Then the kitchen door burst open. Jedediah Finch stumbled out, his movements frantic, his breathing visible even from a distance. He looked around the yard, left, right, listening, like a man trying to outrun his own heartbeat. Then he ran to the stable. Moments later, the stable doors opened again, and out came Bess, Harlan Voss's prize gray mare. Jedediah mounted clumsily, not the controlled movements of a man riding for business, the reckless urgency of someone fleeing a crime. He kicked the horse hard. The mare bolted down the road toward town, disappearing into the dark. Elias stood in the shadows long after the hoofbeats faded. He didn't move, didn't run to the house, didn't call for help, because Elias Drew understood something few people ever learn. Once violence happens, the system moves fast to decide who the villain will be, and that decision rarely favors the truth. By sunrise, the machine would already be turning, the accusation would already be forming, the wrong man would already be in chains, and the silent witness in the trees would soon face the one decision he had avoided for 19 years, whether truth was worth breaking his silence. Because by morning, Clara Hayes would be dead, and someone else would be blamed. Morning has a strange cruelty about it. No matter what darkness happened the night before, the sun rises anyway. On October 18th, 1883, the dawn over Harrow County was calm. Pale gold light slid across the cotton fields. Roosters crowed. Wagons creaked awake. For a few quiet minutes, the world pretended nothing had changed. Then, the scream came. It tore through the Voss estate like a knife through cloth. Thomas, the stable boy, had gone to the kitchen for water before feeding the horses. He pushed the door open halfway, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. Then he saw her. Clara Hayes lay on the stone floor near the pantry door. Her body twisted at an unnatural angle. The lantern beside the counter had burned out hours earlier, leaving only gray morning light spilling through the window to illuminate the scene. Thomas screamed again, louder. Workers rushed from the yard. Kitchen staff crowded the doorway. And within minutes, the house filled with a chaos of voices, fear, confusion, whispers spreading faster than facts. Harland Voss arrived first, still in his nightshirt, face pale. He froze when he saw Clara. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring, as if his mind refused to accept the evidence in front of him. Eleanor Voss pushed past him seconds later. One look at Clara's body, and her hand flew to her mouth. She didn't scream, she didn't faint, but her eyes began scanning the room immediately, looking, calculating, searching for something missing, something wrong. Meanwhile, the crowd outside grew larger. Workers whispered. Servants murmured prayers. Fear moved through them like a slow wave, because everyone understood something dangerous had happened. Violence inside the main house meant power would react, and when power reacts, someone always pays. 30 minutes later, Deputy Thomas Thorne arrived from town, a heavy man with tired eyes and a badge he wore more out of obligation than courage. He surveyed the scene with the detached confusion of a man who wished this responsibility belonged to someone else. "Who found her?" he asked. Thomas raised a trembling hand. Thorne nodded, then stepped carefully into the kitchen. He crouched beside Clara's body, examined the bruising around her neck, the broken dish on the floor, the scattered papers near the counter. But something about the deputy's posture made Eleanor uneasy. He wasn't investigating. He was waiting for someone else to tell him what happened. And right on cue, Jedediah Finch stepped forward. Clean clothes, hair combed, expression carefully arranged into shock. "I believe I know who did this," he said. The room went quiet instantly. Thorne looked up. "Who?" Jedediah hesitated just long enough to make the moment dramatic. "Josiah Miller." A murmur spread through the room. Josiah Miller, the black preacher from the nearby settlement, respected, calm, but outspoken about fairness. A man who occasionally challenged the quiet rules that kept Harrow County comfortable. Convenient, very convenient. Thorne frowned. Why him? Jedediah sighed heavily. Clara and him argued yesterday, loud enough half the yard heard it. That was a lie. But lies delivered confidently often become truth faster than facts. Jedediah continued smoothly. Josiah's got a temper, everyone knows it, and he was seen near the property last night. Another lie. No one challenged him, because accusations in the South during 1883 did not require proof. They required direction, a direction that protected the powerful. Thorne stood slowly. "Where is this Josiah Miller now?" Jedediah shrugged. "Probably at home." Thorne nodded. And just like that, the machine began moving. Within 2 hours, Josiah Miller was dragged from his small cabin outside town, still wearing his Sunday coat, still confused about what he was being accused of. His wife screamed as deputies forced him into a wagon. His children clung to the doorway, but no one listened, because once a narrative begins, the system rushes to complete it. By midday, the entire county believed the same story: a jealous preacher, a late-night confrontation, a tragic murder. Case closed, except for 3 people: Eleanor Voss, Samuel Davies, the merchant who had been riding the road that night, and Elias Drew, the silent witness who had seen the truth from the shadows. Samuel knew he had passed Jedediah Finch on the road after midnight. He remembered the gray mare, the panic in the man's eyes, but Samuel also knew something else. Speaking against Jedediah Finch meant standing against the entire power structure of Harrow County. Merchants lost businesses for less. Men lost livelihoods. Sometimes they lost more. So Samuel said nothing. Eleanor suspected the truth, but had no proof. Her husband trusted Jedediah. The deputy trusted Jedediah, and accusations without evidence could destroy her own household. So she waited. But Elias did something different. He walked quietly to the county jail that evening, past curious townspeople, past deputies who barely acknowledged him, and he sat silently outside Josiah Miller's cell. Josiah looked up from the bench. Their eyes met through iron bars, and in that moment Josiah saw something strange. Not pity, not despair, but certainty. Elias reached into his coat slowly, pulled out a small folded scrap of paper, and slid it across the floor of the cell. Josiah unfolded it carefully. Inside was no message, no words, just a drawing, a simple sketch of the Voss stable, and a small X marked beneath the floorboards. Josiah looked up again. Elias nodded once, then stood and walked away, still silent, still patient, because the truth was already waiting, hidden exactly where Jedediah Finch believed no one would ever look. But there was still one problem. Truth means nothing without a voice willing to deliver it. And the only man who knew everything had not spoken a word in 19 years. But that was about to change. Inside a courtroom that believed he was incapable of speech. And when Elias Drew finally opened his mouth, an entire town would realize the silent man had been holding their secrets all along. And once a witness decides to speak, power begins to panic.
The Harrow County Jail smelled of rust, sweat, and damp wood. Josiah Miller sat on the narrow bench inside his cell, elbows on his knees, the folded paper still clutched in his hands. He had opened it at least 20 times already. The drawing never changed. The Voss stable, and the X beneath the floorboards. Josiah closed his eyes. For hours he had replayed the same question. Why would Elias Drew bring this to me? Everyone in Harrow County knew Elias, the silent man, the strange drifter who worked odd jobs and rarely looked anyone in the eye. Children whispered stories about him. Adults mostly ignored him. And yet, Josiah had always sensed something different in Elias, something watchful, something patient. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Deputy Thorne appeared at the bars, holding a lantern. "You've got visitors," he muttered. Josiah stood slowly. 2 figures approached from the darkness behind the deputy. One was Samuel Davies, the other, Eleanor Voss. That alone was enough to make Josiah's heart pound. The wife of the wealthiest man in Harrow County had just walked into a jail to visit a man accused of murder. Thorne unlocked the door reluctantly.
5 minutes, he grumbled. Then he stepped away. For a moment, none of them spoke. Finally, Eleanor said quietly, "Did Elias come see you?" Josiah nodded. He unfolded the paper and showed them the drawing. Samuel leaned closer to the lantern light. His eyes widened. "The stable," he whispered. "And under the boards," Eleanor added softly. Samuel rubbed his chin. "That's where the old storage compartment is." Eleanor looked at him sharply. "Are you certain?" Samuel nodded. "Used to hold ledgers and grain contracts years back. Harland had it sealed after the renovations." A heavy silence settled over them. Josiah finally spoke. "You think Finch hid something there?" Samuel exhaled slowly. "I passed him on the road last night," he admitted. Josiah's eyes lifted. "You saw him?" Samuel nodded. "Riding hard past midnight." Eleanor's expression darkened. "And he told the deputy he was home all evening." The pieces were beginning to move, slowly, dangerously. Josiah looked down at the drawing again. "Then we need to see what's under those boards." Samuel shook his head immediately. "Not we. If Finch catches us snooping around the Voss estate at night, we'll be lucky to see daylight again." Eleanor's voice was calm. "Then we don't sneak." They both looked at her. "We go in the morning, with Deputy Thorne present." Samuel frowned. "You think Thorne will go along with that?" Eleanor met his gaze. "He works for the county." Then she added quietly, "My husband owns half the county." Morning came with a gathering storm. Dark clouds rolled across the sky as a small group walked toward the Voss stable. Deputy Thorne, Harland Voss, Eleanor, Samuel, and 2 farmhands carrying crowbars. Jedediah Finch stood nearby, watching, his expression polite, but for a briefest moment his fingers tightened around the brim of his hat. Inside the stable, the smell of hay and horses filled the air. Samuel led them toward the back wall. "There," he said, "a section of older floorboards." Thorne knelt and tapped them. "Hollow," he muttered. Jedediah chuckled lightly. "Probably rats." But Eleanor's gaze never left him. "Open it," she said. The farmhands pried the boards loose. Wood creaked. Dust lifted into the air. Then the first board came free. Samuel reached down with the lantern. The light fell into the compartment below, and his face went pale. "Dear God!" Thorne grabbed the lantern and looked. Inside the hidden space lay several objects wrapped in cloth. The deputy pulled them out one by one. A blood-stained handkerchief, a silver letter opener, and a leather pouch. Samuel recognized the pouch instantly. "That belongs to Clara," he whispered. Jedediah spoke quickly. "This proves Josiah robbed her." But Thorne had already opened the pouch. Inside were folded papers, contracts, property agreements, and something else, a handwritten letter. The deputy unfolded it slowly. As his eyes moved across the page, his expression changed. Then he looked up, directly at Jedediah Finch. "What is it?" Harland demanded. Thorne swallowed. "This letter, Clara wrote it yesterday." He hesitated, then read aloud. "Mr. Finch, I cannot keep silent any longer. I know you forged the land deeds from the freedmen's settlement. If these papers reach the county office, you'll be exposed." The stable fell completely silent. Wind rattled the doors outside. Samuel whispered, "He caught him stealing land." Eleanor's voice was colder, "And he killed her before she could report it." All eyes turned to Jedediah Finch. For the first time, the confident banker looked afraid. But he still tried one last lie. "You're all mistaken." That's when a new voice spoke from the doorway, calm, clear, and completely unexpected. "Actually, they are not." All of them turned. Elias Drew stood in the entrance of the stable. rain beginning to fall behind him. The silent man stepped forward slowly, and then he said something that froze every person in the room. "I watched Jedediah Finch kill Clara Hayes." The lantern flickered. Deputy Thorne stared in disbelief. You can talk?" Elias nodded once. "Always could." And with that simple confession, Harrow County's most silent witness had just become its most dangerous voice.
Rain hammered the tin roof of the Voss stable. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed, because the impossible had just happened. The silent man had spoken. Deputy Thorne stared at Elias Drew like he had just seen a ghost. You can talk?" he repeated weakly. Elias stepped further inside, rain dripping from the brim of his worn hat. His voice was steady. "Always could." Samuel Davies let out a stunned laugh under his breath. 20 years? And you never said a word?" Elias shrugged slightly. "People show you their true selves when they think you can't hear them." That sentence hung in the air like a warning. Jedediah Finch's face had gone completely pale. He took a slow step backward. "You expect us to believe this man?" he said sharply. "A drifter who pretended to be mute?" But Elias wasn't looking at him. His eyes were fixed on Deputy Thorne. "I was behind the grain wagon last night, near the kitchen entrance." Thorne blinked. "You saw the murder?" Elias nodded. Clara Hayes confronted Finch about the forged deeds. The deputy glanced down at the letter again. It matched perfectly. "She told him she was going to the county office this morning," Elias continued. Jedediah's breathing had grown shallow. Elias spoke slowly, clearly, every word landing like a hammer. Finch grabbed the letter opener from the counter. Clara tried to run. He caught her near the pantry. Samuel swallowed hard. And then, Elias didn't look away. He strangled her. Thunder cracked outside. For a moment the storm seemed to echo the truth settling over the room. Harland Voss turned slowly toward Jedediah. "Tell me that's a lie." Jedediah opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a laugh that sounded thin and brittle. "This is absurd." But Eleanor Voss was already shaking her head. "You hid the evidence under the stable," she said quietly, "and blamed Josiah." Jedediah's eyes darted around the room, measuring, calculating, searching for an exit. Deputy Thorne stepped forward. "I'm going to need you to come with me." For a moment, Jedediah Finch looked like he might fight. Then his shoulders sagged, and the mask of confidence finally cracked. 3 weeks later, the Harrow County Courthouse was overflowing. Farmers, merchants, workers, even people from neighboring towns had arrived, because word had spread across the region. The silent man was going to testify. Inside the courtroom, Josiah Miller sat beside his lawyer, a free man again. Across the room, Jedediah Finch sat stiffly at the defense table. His once perfect appearance had begun to fray, dark circles under his eyes, hands that wouldn't stop trembling. At exactly 10 o'clock, the judge entered. "Call your first witness." The prosecutor stood. "The state calls Elias Drew." A murmur rippled through the room. Elias walked slowly to the stand. Dozens of eyes followed him, people who had known him for years, people who spoke freely around him, people who whispered secrets believing he couldn't understand. Now they weren't so sure. The prosecutor approached gently. "Mr. Drew, is it true that you have lived in Harrow County for 19 years?" "Yes." "And during that time, most people believed you were unable to speak." "That's correct." "Why?" Elias paused. For the first time, he looked around the courtroom, at the farmers, the bankers, the landowners, the people who held power.
Then he answered, "Because silence lets you hear everything." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the crowd, but Elias wasn't joking. He continued calmly, "I came here after the war. I worked wherever I could, farms, railroads, warehouses." He glanced toward the jury, "And everywhere I went, people talked in front of me." He paused, "About things they shouldn't." The courtroom had gone completely still. The prosecutor asked the question everyone was thinking. "So you pretended to be mute to listen?" Elias nodded. "And in 19 years, I learned who this town really was." Then he turned slightly and pointed directly at Jedediah Finch, and what that man had been doing. Finch's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection!" But the damage had already been done, because Elias wasn't finished. He began describing everything: the forged deeds, the stolen land, the night Clara Hayes confronted Finch, the struggle in the kitchen, the murder, and finally, the hiding place beneath the stable. Every detail matched the evidence. Every word tightened the trap. By the time Elias stepped down from the stand, the entire courtroom knew the outcome. 3 hours later, the jury returned. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant guilty." Gasps filled the room. Jedediah Finch slumped in his chair as deputies grabbed his arms. But before they dragged him away, he twisted toward Elias. His voice was venom. "You think you've won?" Elias didn't respond. Finch sneered. "You've been listening to this town for 20 years. His smile turned ugly. "Tell me, how many secrets do you know?" Elias met his gaze calmly. "Enough." That single word chilled the room, because everyone suddenly realized something. The silent man had heard everything. Deals, threats, crimes, confessions whispered in confidence. And now the one person who knew the darkest truths of Harrow County was finally speaking.
The verdict spread through Harrow County faster than a summer wildfire. By sunset, every porch, tavern, and church step carried the same story. Jedediah Finch, banker, land broker, and pillar of the community, was a murderer. But that wasn't the part that made people uneasy. The part that made them uneasy was Elias Drew. For nearly 2 decades, the quiet drifter had been part of the background of the town, a man who fixed fences, loaded wagons, swept store floors, a man everyone ignored, or worse, spoke freely around. Now those same people were lying awake at night, asking themselves the same question. What did he hear? 3 nights after the trial, Samuel Davies found Elias sitting outside the general store, just watching the empty street. Samuel hesitated before approaching. "Town's nervous about you," he admitted. Elias gave a faint smile. "They should be nervous about themselves." Samuel leaned against the post beside him. "You planning to start telling people secrets?" Elias shook his head. "No." Samuel frowned. "Then why stay silent all those years?" Elias took a long breath. For the first time since the trial, he seemed tired. "Because I wasn't hiding," he said. "I was waiting." Samuel studied him carefully. Waiting for what? Elias looked out toward the dark fields beyond town. For the right moment. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. 1 week later, a letter arrived at the Harrow County Courthouse. No return address, just a simple envelope. Inside were copies of documents, land transfers, forged signatures, illegal contracts, dozens of them, all tied to powerful men in Harrow County. The sheriff recognized the handwriting immediately. Elias Drew.
Within days, state investigators arrived from the capital, quietly, discreetly, but the message was clear. The Finch case had opened a door, and now someone was pushing it wider. Meanwhile, Elias kept working, fixing fences, hauling supplies, just like always. Except now, people watched him differently. Conversation stopped when he walked into a room. Doors closed a little faster. Because nobody knew what Elias had heard over the past 19 years, and nobody knew what he might reveal next. Late one evening, Eleanor Voss found him near the edge of the property. He was repairing a broken gate. "You could leave," she said. Elias kept working. "I could." "Why don't you?" He hammered the final nail into place, then stood. For a moment he studied the distant lights of Harrow County. That town spent 20 years believing I was powerless. Eleanor folded her arms. And now? Elias looked back at her. Now they know better. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "There's something else, isn't there?" she asked quietly. Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and handed her a folded photograph. Old, faded, a Union Army unit from the Civil War. Dozens of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. Eleanor examined it. Then she noticed something. One of the men in the photograph looked exactly like Elias, except younger, stronger, and wearing a captain's uniform. Her eyes widened. "You were an officer?" Elias nodded once. "Before the war ended, I worked in military intelligence." Eleanor stared at him. "You were a spy." "Something like that." "And the silence?" Elias looked toward the town again. "In my line of work, information was power." He paused. "I just never stopped collecting it." Months later, Harrow County began to change. Corrupt officials resigned. Land was returned to families who had been cheated. New laws were written. Slowly, painfully, but the town was becoming something different. And at the center of it all was a man who rarely spoke. Elias Drew still walked the same streets, still wore the same worn coat, still listened more than he talked. But now everyone understood something. The quiet man who had once been invisible was the most dangerous man in the county. Not because he was violent, not because he was powerful, but because he knew the truth. And once the truth starts speaking, it's impossible to silence again.
The trial of Jedediah Finch changed Harrow County. Not overnight, but slowly, like a crack spreading through ice. For years, the town had believed in a simple order: powerful men at the top, everyone else beneath them. Finch's conviction shattered that illusion, and at the center of it all stood a man who had spent 19 years pretending he couldn't speak: Elias Drew. The morning after the verdict, the town felt different. People talked in low voices on the streets. Shopkeepers closed their doors earlier than usual. Conversations stopped whenever Elias walked past. It wasn't anger, it was fear, because suddenly everyone was asking the same question: what else did the silent man hear? Samuel Davies found Elias sitting on the wooden bench outside the general store, the same place he had sat hundreds of times before. But today, people were watching him like he was a loaded gun. Samuel walked over slowly. "You've turned the whole town upside down," he said. Elias didn't look up from the street. "I didn't do anything." Samuel chuckled. "You testified in the biggest murder trial this county has ever seen." "That was the truth," Elias replied calmly. Samuel sat beside him. "You know what people are saying." Elias finally looked at him. "They think you've been listening to them for 20 years. A faint smile touched Elias's face. "I have." Samuel stared at him. "You're serious?" Elias nodded once.
Samuel leaned back against the wall. Well, that's terrifying. That evening, 4 men met in the back room of Harrow County Bank. The door was locked, curtains drawn tight. The men around the table were some of the most powerful figures in the county: Sheriff Nathan Mallory, Judge Walter Carter, land broker Harlan Pike, and businessman Milton Graves. The room was thick with cigar smoke. Mallory broke the silence. "That witness in the Finch trial." Graves frowned. "You mean Elias Drew?" Mallory nodded. "That man is a problem." Judge Carter leaned forward. "He only testified about Finch." Mallory's eyes hardened. "Today." He placed a newspaper on the table. The headline read, "Banker Convicted After Mute Witness Speaks." Mallory tapped the paper. "State investigators are already asking questions." Harlan Pike shifted uncomfortably. "What kind of questions?" Mallory answered quietly. "The kind that lead to old land records, missing contracts, and things we'd rather keep buried." The room fell silent. Everyone there understood what he meant. Finally, Graves spoke. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Mallory's voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm suggesting Elias Drew has been listening to this town for 19 years. He leaned back in his chair. "And if he decides to start talking again—" No one finished the sentence. They didn't need to, because everyone in that room had secrets. Secrets that could destroy reputations, careers, even lives. Judge Carter slowly removed his glasses. "What do you want to do about it?" Mallory's answer was cold. "Make sure he stays silent." At that exact moment, miles away on the edge of town, Elias sat alone in his small wooden house. A lantern burned beside him. The table in front of him was covered with papers, old contracts, property deeds, handwritten notes, every document carefully organized, every name underlined. Elias studied one file in particular. At the top of the page was a name: Sheriff Nathan Mallory. Below it were several lines of notes: illegal land seizures, threats made to farmers, 2 men who had disappeared 5 years earlier. Elias closed the file slowly. Then he placed it with the others in a small wooden box. The box was already half full. 19 years of listening had produced a lot of information. Elias blew out the lantern and looked out the dark window. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. A storm was coming. And deep in his instincts, the instincts of a former intelligence officer, Elias felt something else coming too: danger. Because when powerful men become afraid, they stop playing by the rules. And in Harrow County, 4 very powerful men had just decided the silent witness knew far too much.
The storm arrived just after midnight. Thunder rolled across the plains surrounding Harrow County, and lightning flashed over the quiet rooftops of the sleeping town. Most people stayed inside, doors locked, curtains drawn. But Sheriff Nathan Mallory was wide awake. Inside his office, the oil lamp burned low as he loaded bullets into his revolver one by one. Click, click, click. Across the room stood Harlan Pike and Milton Graves. Neither man looked comfortable. Graves wiped sweat from his forehead. "You're sure about this?" he asked quietly. Mallory didn't look up. "That man has been listening to this town for nearly 20 years. He closed the revolver cylinder with a sharp snap. And now he's already sent one powerful man to prison." Pike crossed his arms nervously. "Finch was reckless. Maybe Elias doesn't have anything on the rest of us." Mallory finally stood. His eyes were cold. "You don't survive 19 years pretending to be mute without learning things." Rain poured down harder, drumming against the roof of Elias Drew's cabin. The 4 men stood on the porch, water dripping from their coats. For a long moment, no one spoke. Sheriff Mallory studied Elias carefully.
The man looked calm, too calm. Most men facing 3 armed visitors in the middle of a storm would be nervous. Elias wasn't. That alone made Mallory uneasy. "Mind if we come in?" Mallory finally asked. Elias stepped aside without a word. The men entered the small cabin. Inside, the lantern cast long shadows across the wooden walls. The room was simple: a table, a chair, a bed in the corner. Nothing unusual, but Mallory's eyes were searching, looking for something. Anything. "Nice place," Milton Graves muttered, trying to sound casual. Elias closed the door behind them. "What brings the sheriff out here so late?" Mallory took a few slow steps toward the table. "We just want to talk." "About what?" Elias asked. Mallory turned to face him. "About the Finch trial." Pike shifted nervously behind Mallory. The storm outside rattled the windows. Mallory spoke carefully. "You've lived in this town a long time, Elias." 19 years, Elias replied. "And in those 19 years, people talked around you." Elias nodded slightly. "Yes." Mallory leaned forward. "So I'm wondering how much you heard." The room fell silent. The lantern flame flickered. Finally, Elias answered. "Enough." The single word hung heavily in the air. Graves cleared his throat. "You understand how dangerous rumors can be." Elias looked at him calmly. "Truth isn't a rumor." Mallory's patience began to thin. "We're not here to argue philosophy." He stepped closer. "We're here to understand whether you plan on causing more trouble." Elias studied the sheriff's face. "I told the truth in court." "Yes," said Mallory, "and sometimes the truth should stay buried." That sentence revealed everything. Pike suddenly looked uncomfortable. "Sheriff," he murmured, but Mallory ignored him. "You've already ruined one powerful man." He lowered his voice. "Some people in this town might not appreciate that happening again." Elias walked slowly toward the table. He picked up the lantern. The light illuminated his face. "You didn't come here to talk," Elias said quietly. Mallory didn't answer. Graves looked toward the door. The tension in the room had become suffocating. Elias placed the lantern back down. Then he spoke again. "Before you do something foolish, there's something you should know." Mallory's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" Elias reached into his coat pocket. For a split second, Mallory's hand flew to his revolver, but Elias only pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table. Mallory stepped forward and unfolded it. His face went pale. It was a copy of a land deed, one signed by Sheriff Nathan Mallory 6 years earlier. A deed that transferred a farmer's property to Harlan Pike. But at the bottom of the page, the signature was clearly forged. Mallory slowly looked up. Elias spoke quietly. "That's just one document." He pointed toward the floorboard beneath the table. "There are dozens more." Pike's face drained of color. "You kept records?" "For 19 years, Elias said. Graves whispered under his breath, "Oh my God." Mallory felt a cold wave run down his spine, because suddenly the situation had changed. This wasn't just a man who knew secrets. This was a man who had evidence. Mallory's voice hardened. "Where are the originals?" Elias shook his head slowly. "Not here." Mallory stepped closer. "Then where?" Elias met his eyes. "In a place that will become very public if anything happens to me." The room fell deadly quiet. The storm outside roared like a warning. For the first time that night, Sheriff Mallory realized something terrifying. They hadn't come here to corner Elias. They'd walked straight into his trap, and the silent man had been ready for them the entire time.
The storm raged outside the cabin, but inside the room, everything had gone completely still. Sheriff Mallory stared at the paper in his hands. The forged deed. The proof. For years he had believed that document was safely buried in the county archives, hidden among thousands of others. But somehow, Elias Drew had found it. And not just found it, copied it. Mallory slowly placed the paper back on the table. "You expect me to believe you've been collecting evidence for 19 years?" he said. Elias didn't blink. "I don't expect you to believe anything." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Then why show us this?" Elias answered calmly. "So you understand the situation." Behind Mallory, Harlan Pike's hands were shaking. "You said the originals aren't here," Pike muttered. "They're not," Elias replied. Graves looked toward the floorboard under the table. "But the copies are." Elias shook his head again. "Not all of them." Mallory's eyes narrowed. "Where are the rest?" Elias didn't hesitate. "In 3 different places." The answer made the room colder. Mallory understood immediately. This wasn't just protection. This was insurance. "If something happens to you," Mallory said slowly, "those papers appear." Elias nodded once. "Exactly." Harlan Pike ran a hand across his face. "You planned this?" Elias looked at him. "No, I prepared for it." Mallory suddenly stepped forward and slammed his hand onto the table. "You think you're smarter than everyone else in this town?" Elias remained calm. "I think I'm patient." The sheriff's eyes burned with anger. "You're blackmailing us." Elias shook his head. "No, I'm protecting myself." Lightning flashed outside the window. For a moment, the cabin filled with bright white light. In that flash, Graves noticed something strange. The room wasn't as empty as it looked. On the far wall were small marks, tiny scratches in the wood, almost like someone had once hung maps there. Military maps. Graves slowly realized something. Elias hadn't just been listening for 19 years. He had been studying, observing, tracking people, like a soldier gathering intelligence. Mallory felt the same thing. "Who are you really?" he asked quietly. Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked toward the window and looked out at the storm. Then he spoke. "Before I came here, I worked for the Union Army." Mallory frowned. "You told the court that." Elias nodded. "But I didn't tell them everything." Pike whispered nervously. "What else is there?" Elias turned back toward them. "My job wasn't fighting." He paused. "My job was information." The realization hit them all at once. Graves spoke first. "You were a spy." Elias didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. Mallory suddenly understood something very important. This man hadn't spent 19 years pretending to be mute because he was afraid. He had done it because he was trained to blend in, to watch, to listen, to collect information. Mallory felt a chill run down his spine. "You came to this town on purpose," he said slowly. Elias gave a small shrug. "At first, I was just passing through." "But then you stayed," Pike said. "Yes." "Why?" For the first time, Elias's expression hardened. "Because I started noticing patterns." "Patterns?" Graves asked. "Land disappearing from poor farmers, records changing in the courthouse, people who asked questions suddenly leaving town." The men in the room said nothing, because every one of them knew those things had happened. Elias continued quietly. "So I started paying attention." He looked directly at Mallory. "And the more I listened, the more I learned." Mallory realized the terrifying truth. For nearly 2 decades, the most dangerous man in Harrow County had been hiding in plain sight, and they had never even noticed. The sheriff took a slow step backward. The situation had completely changed. Killing Elias Drew tonight wouldn't solve anything. It might actually destroy them.
Mallory glanced at Pike and Graves. They looked just as shaken. Finally, Mallory spoke. "What do you want?" Elias answered immediately. "The truth." Mallory scoffed. "That's not a demand." Elias stepped closer. "Yes, it is." He pointed toward the sheriff. "You're going to fix the things you've done." Mallory laughed bitterly. "You think you can force us to clean up the entire county?" Elias met his gaze. "No, I think the evidence can." The storm thundered outside, and in that moment, Sheriff Mallory understood something terrible. The silent man they came to silence had just declared war on the corruption of Harrow County, and the worst part was, he already had the ammunition.
The storm finally began to fade just before dawn. Rain slowed to a quiet drizzle, and the dark clouds above Harrow County slowly drifted east. Inside Elias Drew's cabin, the tension remained thick. Sheriff Mallory stood near the door, his mind racing. This night had not gone the way he expected. He had come here believing Elias was just a quiet laborer who had gotten lucky in court. Instead, he had discovered something far worse, a man who had been watching them for nearly 20 years, and a man who had proof. Mallory looked at Pike and Graves. Both of them looked shaken. For the first time since they had entered the cabin, Mallory realized something important. They had lost control of the situation. Mallory cleared his throat. "What exactly do you want us to do?" Elias stood beside the table, calm as ever. "You start by returning the land." Pike's head snapped up. "That land belongs to me." Elias looked at him quietly. "You mean the land you took from 3 farmers using forged contracts?" Pike's face turned red. "That's not how it happened." Elias reached into his coat and pulled out another folded document. He slid it across the table. Pike grabbed it and opened it. His hands began shaking because it was a copy of another contract, and once again the signature was forged. Graves muttered under his breath, "How many of these do you have?" Elias answered simply, "Enough." Mallory suddenly understood the scale of the problem. This wasn't just about him, or Pike, or Graves. If Elias had been collecting evidence this long, there were probably dozens of names connected to those documents. Names of businessmen, officials, bankers, maybe even the judge. Mallory felt a wave of anger. "You think you're going to clean up the entire county by yourself?" Elias shook his head. "No." Mallory frowned. "Then who?" Elias looked toward the window. The rain had almost stopped now. Morning light was beginning to appear on the horizon. Help is already coming. Mallory's stomach tightened. What help? Elias turned back toward them. The state investigators. Pike blinked. They already left after the Finch trial. Elias gave a faint smile. They will be back. Graves looked confused. Why would they come back? Elias's voice was calm. Because someone sent them a letter. The 3 men froze. Mallory's voice dropped to a whisper. "You?" Elias didn't answer, but the silence said everything. Mallory suddenly grabbed his coat. "We're leaving." Pike looked panicked. "Leaving? What about the documents?" Mallory's voice was sharp. "We're not touching anything." Graves looked toward Elias. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Elias didn't move. "Yes." Graves swallowed hard. "You're going to tear this town apart." Elias replied quietly, "No, this town did that to itself." The 3 men stepped out into the wet morning air. The storm had passed, but the ground was muddy and unstable beneath their boots. As they walked down the dirt road toward town, Pike whispered nervously, "What do we do now?" Mallory didn't answer right away. His mind was racing. They were trapped. If Elias released the evidence, everything would collapse. Careers, reputations, fortunes, even freedom. Finally, Mallory spoke. "We find the evidence."
Graves frowned. "He said it isn't here." Mallory stopped walking. "That doesn't mean it can't be found." Pike looked uneasy. "And if we can't find it?" Mallory turned slowly. Then he said the one thing none of them wanted to hear. "Then we make sure Elias Drew can't release it." Graves stared at him. "You mean kill him?" Mallory's expression was cold. "If we have to." The wind moved quietly through the fields around them. For a moment none of them spoke, because deep down they all knew something was about to happen in Harrow County, something bigger than a murder trial, a war between secrets and truth, and at the center of it stood one quiet man who spent 19 years preparing for this exact moment. Morning light slowly spread across Harrow County. The storm had passed, leaving the fields wet and the dirt roads thick with mud. But inside the sheriff's office, the air felt heavier than the storm itself. Sheriff Nathan Mallory stood behind his desk, staring at the map of the county pinned to the wall. Harlan Pike and Milton Graves sat across from him. Neither of them had slept. Mallory spoke quietly. "He said the evidence is in 3 places." Pike rubbed his tired eyes. "Which means we need to find all 3. Graves shook his head. "You're assuming he told the truth." Mallory turned toward him. "You think he's bluffing?" Graves hesitated. "I think a man who pretends to be mute for 19 years doesn't bluff." That silenced the room. Mallory looked back at the map. If Elias had hidden the documents somewhere, it would be somewhere safe, somewhere no one would think to search. Across town, Elias Drew walked calmly down the main street. The town was beginning to wake. Shopkeepers opened doors. Farm wagons rolled past. But everywhere Elias went, people watched him, some with curiosity, others with fear. Word had spread quickly about what happened at his cabin the night before. People didn't know the details, but they knew the sheriff had visited, and they knew the sheriff had left looking angry. Samuel Davies stepped out of the general store when he saw Elias approaching. "You look like a man who didn't sleep," Samuel said. Elias gave a small nod. "I didn't." Samuel lowered his voice. "Mallory came to see me this morning." Elias stopped walking. What did he want? Samuel glanced around before answering. "He asked if you'd ever given me any papers." Elias studied his face. "And what did you say?" Samuel shrugged. "I told him no." Elias nodded once. That was the correct answer. Samuel frowned. "So there are papers." Elias didn't reply, but Samuel already knew the truth. Back in the sheriff's office, Mallory began pacing. "He start with his cabin," he said. Pike looked uncertain. "We already searched it with our eyes last night." Mallory stopped walking. "Then this time we search properly." Graves leaned forward. "You think he left evidence under the floor?" Mallory nodded slowly. "If I were hiding something important, that's where I'd start." Pike looked uneasy. "And what if we don't find anything?" Mallory's expression darkened. "Then we start watching him." Late that afternoon, while Elias was working near the old railway yard, 3 men quietly approached his cabin: Mallory, Pike, and Graves. The place was empty. Mallory pushed the door open slowly. The cabin looked exactly the same as the night before. Simple, clean, nothing unusual. But this time they weren't just looking, they were searching. Pike began checking the shelves. Graves examined the table. Mallory knelt beside the wooden floorboards. He tapped them carefully, listening. One board sounded different, hollow. Mallory pulled out a knife and wedged it between the boards. With a sharp crack, the wood lifted. The 3 men leaned closer. Inside the hidden space, there was a small wooden box. Pike's heart began racing. That must be it. Mallory lifted the box slowly. It felt light, too light. He opened it. Inside there was only one thing, a folded piece of paper. Mallory unfolded it. His pale went face. Pike grabbed the paper. "What does it say?" Mallory didn't answer, so Graves leaned over and read the message aloud. Written in neat, careful handwriting were only 6 words. "If you found this, you're already too late." The room fell silent. Pike looked around nervously. "Where are the documents?" Mallory suddenly realized something horrifying. The box had never been meant to hold evidence. It had been meant to send a message. Elias had known they would come searching, and he wanted them to. Graves whispered, "He's playing with us." Mallory crushed the paper in his fist. No. He looked toward the door. He's controlling the board. And somewhere across town, Elias Drew was quietly continuing his day, as if the most powerful men in Harrow County weren't desperately chasing secrets he had hidden years before.
The note lay crumpled in Sheriff Mallory's hand. "If you found this, you're already too late." For a long moment, no one spoke. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller. Pike looked around nervously, as if the walls themselves were listening. "He knew we would search this place," Pike muttered. Graves nodded slowly. "That box wasn't for hiding evidence." Mallory's jaw tightened. "It was for sending us a message." Graves crossed his arms. "What message?" Mallory answered coldly, "That we're already behind." Across town, Elias Drew stood beside the old railway platform, repairing a broken fence. The afternoon sun had finally pushed the storm clouds away. A freight train slowly rolled through the yard, its wheels grinding loudly against the steel tracks. To anyone watching, Elias looked like a normal worker finishing a simple job, but his mind was far away. He knew exactly what Sheriff Mallory was doing right now, searching, panicking, trying to regain control. Elias hammered another nail into the fence and wiped his hands on his coat. Then he looked down the road. Samuel Davies was walking toward him. Samuel looked uneasy. "I just heard something," he said when he got close. Elias waited. Samuel lowered his voice. "That Mallory and the others went back to your cabin." Elias gave a small nod. "I expected that." Samuel stared at him. "You expected them to break into your house?" Elias replied calmly, "Yes." Samuel shook his head in disbelief. "You're a strange man, Elias." Elias looked back toward the train yard. "No, I'm a prepared one." Inside the cabin, Pike was beginning to panic. "We're wasting time," he said. "If the evidence isn't here, it must be somewhere else." Graves frowned. "But where?" Mallory was still staring at the empty box. His mind was turning, slowly, carefully. Then something clicked. He looked up suddenly. "The church!" Pike blinked. "What?" Mallory began pacing. "He knows the state investigators will trust certain people in town." Graves followed his thinking. "You mean Josiah Miller?" Mallory nodded. "The preacher." Pike's eyes widened. "You think the documents are with him?" Mallory didn't answer right away, but the idea was growing stronger in his mind. "If Elias wanted those papers protected," Mallory said slowly, "he'd give them to someone honest." Graves muttered under his breath. "That preacher nearly went to prison because of Finch." Mallory nodded, "which makes him the perfect person to trust." Pike stood up quickly. "Then we go to the church." Mallory raised a hand. "Not yet." The other 2 men looked confused. Mallory's voice dropped. "If we go storming into the church, the entire town will notice." Graves frowned. "So what's the plan?" Mallory looked toward the window. Night was slowly beginning to fall again. "We wait." Pike didn't like that answer. "For what?" Mallory's eyes hardened. "For darkness." Meanwhile, Elias finished repairing the fence and packed his tools. Samuel was still standing beside him. "You look calm for a man who just made enemies with half the town," Samuel said. Elias picked up his coat. "I made enemies a long time ago." Samuel sighed. "You're not going to tell me where those documents really are you?" Elias smiled faintly. "No."
Samuel shook his head in disbelief. You know Mallory is going to keep searching. Yes, and if he finds them, Elias interrupted gently, he won't. Samuel studied him carefully. You sound very sure. Elias looked toward the distant church steeple rising above the rooftops of Harrow County. Then he said quietly, because the most important documents aren't hidden in this town anymore. Samuel's eyes widened. What do you mean? Elias turned and began walking down the road. They left Harrow County 2 days ago. Samuel stood frozen. Where did they go? Elias stopped for a moment. Then he answered without turning around. To the one place Sheriff Mallory can't reach. Samuel felt a chill run through him, because suddenly he understood. If the evidence had already left the county, then Elias Drew wasn't just defending himself anymore. He had already begun exposing the entire system. And somewhere far away, people with real authority were probably already reading the secrets of Harrow County.
The note lay crumpled in Sheriff Mallory's hand. If you found this, you're already too late. For a long moment, no one spoke. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller. Pike looked around nervously, as if the walls themselves were listening. He knew we would search this place, Pike muttered. Graves nodded slowly. That box wasn't for hiding evidence. Mallory's jaw tightened. It was for sending us a message. Graves crossed his arms. What message? Mallory answered coldly, that we're already behind. Across town, Elias Drew stood beside the old railway platform, repairing a broken fence. The afternoon sun had finally pushed the storm clouds away. A freight train slowly rolled through the yard, its wheels grinding loudly against the steel tracks. To anyone watching, Elias looked like a normal worker finishing a simple job, but his mind was far away. He knew exactly what Sheriff Mallory was doing right now, searching, panicking, trying to regain control. Elias hammered another nail into the fence and wiped his hands on his coat. Then he looked down the road. Samuel Davies was walking toward him. Samuel looked uneasy. I just heard something, he said when he got close. Elias waited. Samuel lowered his voice, that Mallory and the others went back to your cabin. Elias gave a small nod. I expected that. Samuel stared at him. You expected them to break into your house? Elias replied calmly. Yes. Samuel shook his head in disbelief. You're a strange man, Elias. Elias looked back toward the train yard. No, I'm a prepared one. Inside the cabin, Pike was beginning to panic. We're wasting time, he said. If the evidence isn't here, it must be somewhere else. Graves frowned. But where? Mallory was still staring at the empty box. His mind was turning, slowly, carefully. Then something clicked. He looked up suddenly. The church! Pike blinked. What? Mallory began pacing. He knows the state investigators will trust certain people in town. Graves followed his thinking. You mean Josiah Miller? Mallory nodded. The preacher. Pike's eyes widened. You think the documents are with him? Mallory didn't answer right away, but the idea was growing stronger in his mind. If Elias wanted those papers protected, Mallory said slowly, he'd give them to someone honest. Graves muttered under his breath. That preacher nearly went to prison because of Finch. Mallory nodded, which makes him the perfect person to trust. Pike stood up quickly. Then we go to the church. Mallory raised a hand. Not yet. The other two men looked confused. Mallory's voice dropped. If we go storming into the church, the entire town will notice. Graves frowned. So what's the plan? Mallory looked toward the window. Night was slowly beginning to fall again. We wait. Pike didn't like that answer. For what? Mallory's eyes hardened. For darkness. Meanwhile, Elias finished repairing the fence and packed his tools. Samuel was still standing beside him. You look calm for a man who just made enemies with half the town, Samuel said. Elias picked up his coat. I made enemies a long time ago. Samuel sighed. You're not going to tell me where those documents really are you? Elias smiled faintly. No. Samuel shook his head in disbelief. You know Mallory is going to keep searching. Yes.
And if he finds them, Elias interrupted gently, he won't. Samuel studied him carefully. You sound very sure. Elias looked toward the distant church steeple rising above the rooftops of Harrow County. Then he said quietly, because the most important documents aren't hidden in this town anymore. Samuel's eyes widened. What do you mean? Elias turned and began walking down the road. They left Harrow County 2 days ago. Samuel stood frozen. Where did they go? Elias stopped for a moment. Then he answered without turning around. To the one place Sheriff Mallory can't reach. Samuel felt a chill run through him, because suddenly he understood. If the evidence had already left the county, then Elias Drew wasn't just defending himself anymore. He had already begun exposing the entire system. And somewhere far away, people with real authority were probably already reading the secrets of Harrow County.
Night returned to Harrow County quietly. Lanterns lit the streets. Windows glowed softly in the dark. But inside Sheriff Mallory's office, tension had reached a breaking point. Mallory stood beside the window, staring out into the street. Pike paced the room like a trapped animal. Graves sat at the desk, rubbing his temples. None of them liked the situation they were in. Finally, Pike spoke. If the documents really left the county, we're finished. Mallory didn't turn around. We don't know that for certain. Graves looked up. You think Elias lied? Elias was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head slowly. No. That single word made Pike stop pacing. Then what are we doing sitting here? Mallory turned to face them. We're thinking. Pike scoffed. We should be running. Mallory's voice hardened. Running makes you look guilty. Graves muttered under his breath. At this point, we are guilty. Across town, Elias Drew sat quietly in the back of the small church. The room was dim, lit only by a few candles near the altar. Josiah Miller stood beside him. The preacher looked worried. I heard the sheriff searched your cabin today. Elias nodded. They did. Josiah sighed. That means they're getting desperate. Elias looked toward the tall windows of the church. Moonlight filtered through the glass. Desperate men are predictable. Josiah sat down beside him. You told Samuel the documents left the county. Elias didn't answer. Josiah studied his face. Was that the truth? Elias remained quiet for a moment. Then he spoke softly. Some of them. Josiah leaned forward. Some? Elias nodded. I kept the most important ones here. Josiah blinked. Here? In the church? Elias pointed toward the wooden floor beneath the pews. Under the old foundation. Josiah stared at him. You hid evidence under a church? Elias shrugged. No one searches holy ground. Josiah shook his head slowly. That's either very clever or very dangerous. Elias replied calmly. Both. At that exact moment, Sheriff Mallory reached the same conclusion. Inside his office, he slammed his fist onto the desk. The church! Graves looked up sharply. You still think the documents are there? Mallory nodded. Yes. Pike frowned. But Elias said they left the county. Mallory's voice was cold. That's exactly why I don't believe it. Graves leaned forward. You think he lied to mislead us? Mallory nodded again. He's been playing games with us since the beginning. Pike grabbed his coat. Then let's go to the church right now. Mallory stopped him. Not yet. Pike groaned in frustration. What now? Mallory walked toward the door. We wait until Elias is asleep. Graves looked uneasy. You're planning to break into a church. Mallory didn't hesitate. I'm planning to save our lives. Later that night, the streets of Harrow County grew quiet. Most of the town had gone to sleep. Only a few lanterns still burned in the windows. 3 shadows moved silently through the darkness. Sheriff Mallory, Harlan Pike, Milton Graves. They approached the church carefully. The tall wooden doors stood closed. Mallory pushed one open slowly. The hinges creaked.
Inside, the church was silent. Rows of empty pews stretched toward the altar. Moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows. Graves whispered, "This feels wrong." Mallory ignored him. "Start searching." The three men spread out across the church. Pike checked behind the altar. Graves examined the walls. Mallory walked slowly down the center aisle. His boots echoed against the wooden floor. Then he stopped. One of the floorboards looked different, older, looser. Mallory knelt down and pulled out his knife. Carefully, he pried the board upward. It lifted with a dull crack. Pike rushed over. "What did you find?" Mallory reached inside the hidden space. His hand touched something. A bundle of papers. He pulled them out. Contracts, letters, records. Josiah leaned closer to the lantern. His face turned pale. "These are them." Pike laughed nervously. "We found them!" Mallory began flipping through the documents quickly, and then he froze, because something was wrong, very wrong. The papers weren't about him, or Pike, or Graves. They were about someone else entirely. At the top of the first page was a name, Judge Walter Carter. Josiah whispered in shock. Why would Elias keep evidence against the judge here, and not us? Mallory's stomach tightened, because suddenly he understood. They had just discovered something they were never supposed to see. And somewhere in the dark church behind them, a floorboard creaked.